I have a microphone for the viewers at home, so I'll try to talk loud enough for everyone to hear. If you can't hear us at any point, just raise your hand and we'll speak louder. So my name is Jeff Bagg. I'm a project manager at the Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, and I'm here with Ron Barron, who's an assistant planner in our office and has been working on this project. The majority of the work has been done by Ron in the data collection and analysis. What we're going to try to do tonight is spend about probably 40 minutes going over information via the PowerPoint presentation, and then in discussions with the town administrator, we'll post this presentation on the town's website, and I think the meeting's being recorded for future broadcasts on your local access television. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what this project is and how it came to be, give a brief history of some of the growth and development patterns here in Rutland, talk about an overview of the study methodology and research, provide you with some preliminary fiscal impact findings, review some of the potential impacts that come along with residential growth, and then talk a little bit about next steps. So what this presentation is a grant-funded project through the District Local Technical Assistance Program. So it's money that is allocated from the state to the regional planning agencies. And so towns have access to this funding for sort of small to medium-sized projects. And through the town administrator's work, came to the committee to ask for a relatively small amount of money to take a look at some of the growth patterns that are happening currently. And what that really entails is taking a look at some of the development that has been previously approved but not yet built. And so what we are looking at is, I think it's here. The scope for this project is fairly narrow. And what we're trying to look at is the potential impact of approximately 400 lots that have been previously approved but not built. And so many of you who live in town already have or are going to start seeing some of these lots being constructed. And I think looking back and realizing that there were these approved subdivision lots that are going to start coming online a little more rapidly, that this study is really intended to take a look at that situation and determine if there were going to be potential impacts or what it really meant for the town. And midway through our research, we really found that there's some stuff to look at. There's some issues that warrant further study. And so we were happy to learn that the state set up another technical assistance grant funded program, and with the town administrator's guidance, we've made an application to the state through the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs for a more significant amount of money to fund what we're calling phase 2 of this study. So we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. I think what's important for me to mention here is that, you know, the relatively small amount of money and time that we're devoting to this will give us a set of data points that's accurate enough for us to look back over the past couple of years and then anticipate what may happen with 400 new houses coming online in a fairly short amount of time. So the additional grant funding will allow us to look forward. So again, I think the emphasis for this night is that we're looking at a relatively small snapshot in time of subdivisions that have already been approved but not built. And we can do some calculation of when they might come online and some analysis of that. The future funding would allow us to do what's called a build-out analysis and a complete fiscal impact. So the future step would be looking 10 to 20 years out and trying to explore what other developable properties there are in town and how many lots that might, how many lots that may be. The last thing I'll say as sort of an introductory remark is with the fact that the subdivision lots have already been approved, there's not much that the town can currently do to stop or slow those lots from being built. They've already been approved, so they're in the queue. The opportunity for the town is, with this next phase, is to look ahead and determine the potential growth rates in the future, and then make decisions about how to potentially make certain changes. So as part of a brief history of growth and development, we're sort of looking back to two general phases. One is the 1999-2000 timeframe, which is when the town completed its first master plan. And so, within this document, there's information that is available to us and others. And interestingly, at that time, significant residential growth was occurring as well, and it was a concern. And there was a concern about community character and the potential impacts. Interestingly, flash forward, we're looking at what may be a similar situation. And so we look back to this time frame for some of the data. The other place that we go back to is the US Census and American Community Survey information, which goes back basically each decade. So we go back to about 1990 for some of our research. For some of you, you may be familiar with the residential growth, and you can see it. I mean, I've been working in town as a part-time planner for about a year. Pretty minimal hours allocated, but I've been working with the planning board on projects that are coming through. And so I have a familiarity with the town and some of the growth patterns. So a lot of the images that we tried to collect are recent. And so as residents, you're seeing houses come up. And we're going to talk through a little bit of how they're occurring. But generally, the rate of growth has and continues to occur at a significant rate, and we'll try to put some numbers to that. This slide is probably the most complicated one that we have, but tells a story. So on the left-hand side, at the bottom, we're at 1990, and the bars going across are building permits issued basically every year.
If
Yes.
you don't mind, I just want to make sure that we clarify that those numbers actually represent not just units for individual houses, but they're housing units themselves. They're basically households. So some of these large numbers that may look very shocking, those also include single-family housing and some multifamily housing, and there's a lot in there. So just in case there's anybody in the room who happens to be more familiar with the rate of permits, that just so you can see where the clarification is on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's important. So that's where the accuracy of the data, I mean, we are looking back to see what the patterns are and what the potential issues are. And there's definitely some patterns here. The bars are building permits being granted over the course of several years. And you can see some increases around here. 1999, there 78 building permits being issued in 1 year, significant, a little dip, and it's going up to the middle chart here reaches about 101 building permits in a single year. I mean, we're at 97, 89, and in 2006 there seems to be a little bit of a sporadic spike up to 133 building permits, which we would probably account to a subdivision at that time being completed and built out. So a series of building permits to complete a subdivision. Then the corresponding dip after 2006 is really a good illustration of the housing market changes and what is generally called the Great Recession. But it does really kind of show how you could perceive this to be a bubble, a housing market bubble, and then the subsequent recession really pushed down building permit levels. The 2015 marker is there, 2016 and 17. it's all existing information that we have available through the building department. And then the orange last 3 bars are something, I mean, that's the real crux of what we're going to talk about tonight is if you took 400 building lots and based it on an average buildable rate from the past trends, you might see growth go in the, and this is hypothetical, so we don't know exactly how this would occur, but this is it's feasible to think that the building permits will be going up and that 82 building permits being issued in 1 year is not unprecedented. So there's some significant potential for building permits to continue over the next couple of years. The line across the top is the population. So in 1990, the population was 4,936. And so you have a pretty steady increase. And we have, through our Central Mass Regional Planning Commission's research, we have some projections and we have some other information. We get into some differences in data sources when you get to 2015, which has the population generally identified as 8,316 people who live in Rutland. And then based on the information in the town's annual report, you see some kind of increase, some kind of jump up to about 8,850, which is generally the number that's currently being used for the population of Rutland right now. And through the projections that Ron will talk about in a few minutes about how he came to these conclusions and the data that was used, you would expect these 400 lots to increase the population somewhere in the vicinity of just under 10,000 people. And so one of the biggest questions is how fast will that happen? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The other thing that's on this slide, it's important for me to mention that the town has by no means been doing nothing. So there's been a series of efforts made to change zoning or work on the subdivision regulations. But one of the important things I think to mention at this point is the red line in the middle represents a growth management bylaw that was proposed in 2003. And ultimately, it did not get 2/3 majority vote at town meeting. It would have been a zoning bylaw change. What it would have done is from 2003, this is the language that was presented at town meeting, from 2003 to 2008, with an opportunity to extend the date, it would have capped the number of building permits issued to 56 per year. And with the limited amount of detail we could go into in this study, we don't know exactly what that would have done, but hopefully with a second round of funding we can look a little more carefully at this. But you would imagine that if in 2003 the number of building permits were capped off at 56, it would have taken these, a significant number and pushed them across, and it would have leveled out the building activity over about 10 years. So again, we don't have a definitive conclusion about that, but it's noteworthy in that you'll see from 2003 was some of the most significant spikes in increases in building permit activity. So as Ron said, some of this is mixed types of housing, but as many of you know, the subdivisions that are being built are fairly consistent with each other. So think like a 4-bedroom house. So that's the majority of what's being constructed. I do see questions. I think I'll try to take questions, but if I defer to the end, that might just don't be I may defer to the end. So you had your hand up first, actually.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, that's the permits granted, but were they built? Can you tease that out?
We did not look at that.
Do you know how many? It's just 400 that you know that are in queue that are.
Well, there's the permits are for the 400 lots that are ready to be built on. These actually represent permits for housing units, not just, so these were the ones that were issued by the town. Whether or not anything for building a house, whether or not that went through, we don't really know. We didn't have any data to correlate with that, but that's what that's representing. So it's slightly different than what we were talking about with the 400 lots that are currently approved.
Right, and I guess, you know, it's good, these are good questions, and you will be able to stump us. It's not that hard, because this is kind of just looking back to assess whether further study is necessary. And so, I mean, you'll, I think, agree by the end of this that yes, further study is necessary, and there's tools, the build-out analysis and the complete fiscal impact analysis that we would be encouraging the town to look at. So this is sort of in isolation. This is Rutland. And what we started to look at was how does the growth in Rutland compare to the region? And so our office has historically worked in subregions, and we have a study called the Rural 11. So there are 11 towns that are dubbed rural. Rutland is one of them. And so I think on the next chart I have the list of the towns. But for comparison, what we wanted to do was see how Rutland was looking in terms of growth patterns compared to the region. So the blue line at the bottom is an average number of building permits issued in the other 10 rural towns. And I will say that Holden, just so you know, Holden is not in the rural 11. So Holden, you know, could have some similarities here, but let's see, let me do this real quick. The other towns, just for reference, are Barry, Brookfield, Oakham, Hardwick, Warren, West Brookfield, East Brookfield, New Braintree, North Brookfield, and Princeton. So they're pretty rural. But when you look at these numbers, we started to see that the growth rate in Rutland has been significantly higher than other communities in the rural 11. And so this is important for a whole range of reasons, but when we start to look again at the Great Recession period, so 2010 through 2015, the average number of building permits issued in those other towns is extremely low, whereas Rutland maintained 30 to 40, which by other town standards, that in and of itself is high. So then you go back to the previous years and you see the spikes. And so the economy was doing really well between 95 and 2000, and there was a minor recession, which probably signifies the dip. And then the years from 2000 to 2009 basically is when housing was increased, and you can really see those patterns occurring here. We're not sure exactly what the projected growth rate is, and that's something that this phase 2 study would reveal. But if you look at the ending number 55 on the right, that's the number of permits issued this year. It begs the question a little bit about where you would be coming from here, this midpoint 2000, and talking about these lots that are going to come online. This growth pattern here is not unprecedented, so that's what we'll talk through over the next couple minutes. Yes?
Did you already mention if there is currently a cap on permits per year at the LSU? I know you said there was maybe a vote reduced or something.
Right, so currently there is no cap. Towns are, and I'll speak to this under the subdivision, towns are pretty limited with what they can do to regulate growth. And I'll speak to that in a moment, but one of the things out of this study and the next study is to put together like a menu or best practices that other towns have faced similar situations. It's not that uncommon, except it's maybe unique in this region. Eastern Mass towns have experienced things like this before, so there are some tools, and so we'll talk through some of those. But my point was that in 2003 there was an effort, and it didn't pass at town meeting for various reasons. So again here, what we wanted to do, and this was Ron's great advice, was we looked at 2015. In the region generally, there was an average of 3 building permits issued for housing in a lot of the towns. And we looked at the 30 number for Rutland, and we started to wonder, well, what was really happening? Is there some snafu in the data? So we looked at 2015 alone, and here's where you can see the breakout of actual permits and where we got the average from. So Rutland has 30, Barry had 9, but the remainder of the towns, if they issued 4 building permits, that was what they did in a year. Again, in Rutland did 30. So we kind of took the snapshot to just double check the accuracy in terms of the rate of growth happening here, and it seems real. So many of you, I'm sure, are aware of some of this, but I'm going to take just a real quick introductory 101 level class on residential development. It generally occurs in two primary methods, and this is statewide. These are state-generated regulations. The approval not required process, also, like people call that ANR, in a standard or conventional subdivision process. So I'm going to walk through these for a few minutes and then hand it over to Ron to talk about the actual data. ANR lots, this is such a complex set of laws. Massachusetts is blessed with having, it's dubbed the worst in terms of zoning regulations, and antiquated, archaic, and really challenging. And ANRs are a really good example. There's a handbook. It's 120 pages of case law that talks about all these ways that it can go differently in every town. But the main thing is that for a planning board in every town has very little jurisdiction, very little authority to do or deny an ANR lot. So an ANR lot is something that has a certain amount of feet road frontage and a certain lot size. And so the towns can dictate how much frontage is required and how much area is required. But other than that, that's what the planning board looks at, and if the lot proposed meets that, then it's approved as a building lot. And to make matters worse, if the planning board gets an ANR submission and doesn't do anything in 21 days, then it's automatically approved as a building lot. So the state law is really generally leaning towards the developer and leaning towards housing with the ANRs. And so it's a challenging thing. But the point is that our study doesn't really even look at the ANR lots at this point, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot of, consistently over the years in Rutland, there have been a lot of ANR lots being created. So surveyor creates it, carves off the land. It gets this approval not required. So the irony of the name is that approval is not required. And then you're able to get a building permit. So there's a lot of building that's happening via ANRs, which is roads that exist at a certain point in time are eligible for that. And I see a question. So the big distinguishing factor here is ANRs are available on roads that exist. And so if you don't have a road and you're going to build houses, then you're moving into the next category, which is subdivisions. So I can take your question.
So the only way you can change that, if that's a law, is the town of Rutland basically just rezone and say, okay, the road's existing, but the lot size, we're saying, okay, you have to have whatever, 2 acres to do it. Does the town have control over that part of it?
Some. There's case law that if you, for a moment, had the mentality to say, oh, we'll make, every lot has to be 10 acres and requires 700 feet of road frontage, and thinking that you could spread out. And so the case law is really pretty clear that there are limits. And most towns have tried to explore them and tested them, and you don't get much more than, really rural towns, maybe 200 feet of frontage, 250 feet of frontage. So there are limits. And so, Rutland has 150 feet frontage district and 200 feet. And so it's not out of character. Most towns, that's where they kind of fall.
So second follow-up question to that then is, does the town have leeway in when they then get to the building permit situation? Or is that built into Massachusetts law also? That we say it has to be 1 story and no bigger than 3,000 square feet. I mean, whatever, does the town have control over that?
Again, yeah, so again, with regulating single-family housing, there's, from the state law and in case law, there's very limited ability for towns to regulate single-family houses. You get a lot more ability to regulate multifamily or other things by special permit, but when you look at the development of these frontage lots, It's something that's kind of thrust onto communities with limited, especially with frontage lots. So there are some things, driveway access, so common driveways. There are some potential abilities to look at regulations about steep slopes, but you know, that's kind of part of that menu of options. It would not really prevent development of a frontage lot. It may, in some very rare cases, do that, but otherwise it's tough. I see two hands here. Yes.
So ANR lots, once they're approved for building, is there any environmental restrictions? Or is it just you meet the size and there's a road there, you can build?
A wetland regulation would still apply. So, you know, it's where you pass the test for frontage and area. If there are wetlands, then that's when the building inspector would, at the building permit application, there should be a transmittal to the Conservation Commission if there's wetlands, and then that process would unfold, yes. So, yes, Janet.
Yeah, so if the town were to pass new zoning, as mentioned earlier, wouldn't all of those lots be grandfathered under the old zoning? I didn't ask to stump you either.
What usually happens with a zoning amendment is, let's say you're preparing next year, and next year's town meeting, you have a zoning bylaw change. It would affect lots going forward.
Right.
The ANR has a lot of funky provisions where if they filed an ANR lot, they get protection for a couple of years. So there's lots of caveats and pitfalls there, but it's definitely something to look at. But
Numbers to kind of level off and catch up with ourselves.
yeah, my caution would be that ANR lots are harder to regulate than the changes that we can talk about with subdivisions. So I'll try to shift gears so I can keep us on track. Subdivisions is the bulk of the lots that we have lingering around. Subdivisions are valid for a long time, so they can go on and on without any activity, and then all of a sudden someone's ready. So this is Bryce Lemon. So this is the entrance on Main Street. This was taken the other day. So this is the kind of activity that most residents will start seeing. This is a pretty prominent area. This is 112 lots subdivision that was approved originally in 2006, and then it was sort of modified and reapproved in 2014. So it's still going forward, and it's actually. This is part of the 400. This is my, so that, thank you. This is a sort of a case study, sort of one subdivision example to kind of just run through of several that are of significant size that contribute to the 400. I'm sure many of you are maybe familiar or know about that. I mean, it's at Main Street, runs on the south here, the bottom of the picture, and then Sharnock Hill runs up. This is the general area of this subdivision, and what I tried to do, so this is just one part of the subdivision plan that shows the general lot layout. There's a couple cul-de-sacs in there, and it basically goes from Main Street to Sharnock Hill. So I turned the picture and tried to superimpose it a little bit onto that aerial. So down here is the Rufus Putnam house, and then the Main Street picture that I just showed is the access coming up here, and then the lots are going up through that existing wooded area, and there's another entrance on Sharnock Hill. The way that this development took shape is that the owner of the property, the developer, was also extending sewer service from the center of town down Main Street, up Sharnock Hill to service this subdivision. And so you probably have seen some of that activity happening. This is the entrance from Sharnock Hill to Bryce Lemon. So they are actively pursuing the subdivision approval that they have. There's a couple houses, model houses that are under construction. There's infrastructure being installed. The road is beginning to take shape. So you would expect to see this subdivision probably, we don't know for sure, but you would expect to see this subdivision take shape next spring, and the 112 lots will get built. And so that's sort of that representative example of how we get to 400 pretty quick. I believe this is the largest of the subdivisions that have been approved and not built, but there's a couple that are of other significant size, I'll say. Let me just check something quick for a second here. I think there is, I had a note here, so this is not uncommon. So this is very representative of the subdivision process. So the developer generally takes on a pretty big risk and takes on the financial liability to purchase the land, get all the subdivision plans approved, then puts out a bond for basically the full cost of installing all of the roads and all of the utilities and the street lights and the sidewalks. And so once that is completed is when the burden sort of shifts from the developer over to the town, and the town takes on certain responsibilities after everything is constructed. And so you as town meeting members might have heard like road acceptance. So that's sort of the final stage of a subdivision process where the developer has fulfilled all of his duties, and then the houses are built, and the road gets turned over, and some of the infrastructure gets turned over to the town. So this is just another example of a subdivision. This photo was taken probably 2 months ago of a road that the town may or may not see for acceptance soon. So their houses are all occupied. The road is essentially going to be completed, and the understanding of a subdivision is that when everything's done, the town will accept responsibility for maintenance, plowing, and upkeep of the infrastructure. So if there's sewer, the town will maintain those responsibilities. But that's common for subdivisions, and that's the way that they work. And it all kind of contributes to the fiscal landscape. So I'm almost ready to hand it over to Ron for some more fun details. But the fiscal landscape is important because when the burden shifts over to the town, there's a whole bunch of factors that come into play. So there are benefits to the town. The benefits of the town are that each of those lots produces a residential tax revenue. And for most towns, if not all, a huge majority of towns in Massachusetts rely on residential tax revenue for most of their budgets. And so as you probably know, it pays for schools, library, recreation, public safety. So it goes to pay for police officers, fire department personnel, and then public services that you would expect for road maintenance and plowing, so the Department of Public Works. And it's really a balancing of the revenue and expenditures that can be really challenging, and that's what the town administrator does. That's what town meeting does when they're looking at certain things. And again, a lot of towns rely on the residential tax revenue. Yes.
So just a quick question. I know that the newspaper is writing all this down. It's going to be in the newspaper like, oh, this is wonderful. We're going to have more revenue. Is there any way to prove that out? Because when you put the kids through school and you need new roads and you need another pool, and it's not always a good thing.
Right.
So how do we educate? Like right now you're educating 50 people, but how do we then educate 8,800 people as to the true impact?
Well, and that's actually what the next section is going to be, because we made an effort to try to calculate that.
Right, and it's all part of, there's no silver bullet, this is more of an art. When you get into the fiscal aspect, and the questions that you're asking are great, it's more of an art than a science, because there's so many variables that are unknown until they are actually present, and then there's a reaction to them. So we'll get to that. Just be mindful that our scope is really looking back at we have some known criteria that we're looking at, the lots that are existing. the future phase 2, is going to be really critical to looking at the future growth and the future fiscal impacts, and that's going to answer your question, I hope. So just simple chart on the left is revenues, and so you know, there are some commercial tax revenue. It's just not a lot in Rutland, but 72% of the revenue, this is an average over a couple of years, comes from property tax. And then the balancing is on the right, the expenditure side, is that the revenue generator is also the revenue spender. The expenditures are going to pay for support of the residential growth, which is giving you the tax revenue. So it's a balancing act. And this will be available, so you can go through those numbers. But just generally, the fiscal impact is really how a municipal budget is going to get affected by new investment, construction, employment, population, and school enrollment. So there's all these factors, and within each of those factors, there's a lot of variability, so which makes it more of the art and not the science. And I think I'm almost done. This is my last bit, but the big cog down here is new businesses and homeowners generate the new property tax. They pay income tax, they pay motor vehicle tax, so it's important to have growth because you are getting your revenue from the growth. But at the same time, it's turning this other wheel of costs. So you have then added, so the roads need to be maintained and there's costs. When you have more people, you might have more police service, more police calls, and then the fire department needs to have a certain amount of staff for a certain number of population. So your traffic is an important one too. It'll eventually cause certain intersections to maybe need to be looked at for certain standards. And then the net result is whether your municipal the budget is a positive or a negative, and so that's the balance. And so we're shifting gears here to what Ron's going to do is talk a little bit more about the actual data that we have and some of the projections, and then we'll close it up with some next steps, and then we'll answer other questions. So,
Did you have a question before we started? Or?
In your study, in the number of building permits that were issued, did you break them down to how many bedrooms or the size of the house? Because a 4-bedroom house is going to produce more people than a 2 or 3-bedroom house.
Mm-hmm.
And the size might have something to do with it, and therefore with those numbers, how did you extrapolate to how many people we were projected to have in the future?
it's a
Well,
perfect segue.
Yeah. Well, with that graph that we were showing earlier, those were 2 different data sets. We didn't come up with those numbers. Those were the census numbers compared to the recorded permits that we got from Housing and Urban Development. So we were just trying to compare the numbers that they tracked actually through the census and through the population estimates that they do with the American Community Survey.
We're not from Rutland.
No, those were from Rutland. Oh, the numbers weren't calculated from Rutland, but they were reflecting actual population counts in Rutland and actual building permits from Rutland. But they were reported to the federal government, and that's where we got the data from.
I think there is some information that Ron has that will start to get to your other question about the bedroom type and the count. Generally, there's some information about that.
Well, we don't really look at the bedroom type in count because we'll get into why we chose the data points that we ended up choosing. But suffice to say, there's not a real good way of predicting how that's going to happen, at least not with the data that we started off with. So we tried to make it as normalized as possible, and we looked at sort of in a broad way what types of housing we were going to be looking at. But we didn't break it out in that fine of a grain. But we'll get to how we chose the data that we did in a minute. So just wanted to reintroduce myself. I'm Ron Barron. I'm an associate planner with CMRPC. I started working on this with Jeff pretty much from the beginning. And when the town came to us, they came to us with the notion that They had a certain number, as Jeff had said, of properties that had been approved, they hadn't been built, and they wanted to get a sense of what that'll do to the finances of the town and to services and what kind of impacts that would have. So what we worked on was this fiscal impact analysis. And what a fiscal impact analysis tries to answer is the question of when you have all of these units that are built and there's people living in them, how is the balance between cost and revenue affecting the town? So we started off and we looked at a few broad topics. We wanted to see how many new people we could potentially estimate were going to be brought in when all these houses got developed. We wanted to look at what kind of tax revenue we could be looking at. We wanted to look at new students and a lot of different factors like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through. I know a few people really, really love spreadsheets, but the vast majority of people don't seem to like them very much. So what I tried to do is break it out into just the findings, and then I'll sort of walk through how we came up with the numbers that we're showing here. So the first question we wanted to do is get some sort of verification for how many lots we were looking at. And the way we did this is we used a combination of looking at the assessor's data that we have internally at CMRPC and having conversations with the town. And we came up with, almost 300 lots, and they had another 100 some odd lots. And so we decided to settle on the number of 400 because it was a nice round number. It would give us a good starting point for being able to estimate some of these projections. And again, what we're looking to do here is not drop an actual number. We're not trying to tell you exactly how many people are going to show up. We want to be able to give you a guide so that you'll be able to have some sort of feel of what can happen when all of these houses actually do get built. All of the lots we assumed, we had to make a few assumptions. The first assumption that we made is that they were all going to be single-family homes. And that's not necessarily because that's the only thing that gets built. It's just that that seems to be what has been being built the most in recent years. And also it simplifies the estimates and makes them more conservative. We tried to simplify the estimates as much as possible to make the number actually lower than it would be than err on the side of it being bigger. So by looking at single family homes, we're only looking at a very narrow type of housing, and it's going to give us a lower number than it would if you built a lot of 2-family, 3-family, multifamily homes. We also assume that all of these are going to be, we're only looking at subdivisions, and we're not including the ANRs that Jeff talked about in any of these estimates. And again, the reason why is because ANRs don't tend to have the same life cycle where you get a bunch of them approved at once and they just sort of sit there and wait to be developed. They tend to be approved and built in a different pattern than some of the subdivisions we were looking at. So the first calculation that we did was we tried to make an estimate of population growth. So this is again assuming that every single lot that is out there and hasn't been approved is built and people are living in them and they're all single family homes. So it's a very standardized way of looking at it. You may notice that we actually used the population estimates from the American Community Survey from 2015. We didn't go with the numbers from the annual report, and that's because we have the population count and a household count that comes from the same data set. And when you're trying to do these kind of calculations, it's always better to keep the same data, comparing apples to apples. It just makes it a lot easier, minimizes the amount of error that you can put in. So based on that, we got a persons per household calculations of almost 3. It was 2.6 is what we were looking at. And we actually did an estimate of a sample subdivision. We actually took the town census data, looked at it for a recently developed, and I'll talk a little bit about this because we wanted to get some sort of estimate for students, and that's one of the slides we have. But we actually found that that was right about what we were looking at when we looked at the sample subdivision. It was about, I want to say it was like about 3.1, 3.2. So it was fairly close. So based on this we were looking at over 1,000 new residents that were going to show up just in these units. Again, this is very conservative. This is not including multifamily. It's not including 3-family, 2-family, any other type of building that could show up in any of these lots. So just to give you sort of a sense of what that means, when we have, this slide is showing the projected populations that CMRPC did based on trends from 2015. So based on the 2015 trends, I don't know if you can see it, but we started off in 2015 with 8,300 people estimated by this is again American Community Survey data. And then it was projected that by 2020, we'd have 8,570. By 2030, you'd have 9,140, et cetera. It's important to note that the town is already recording that in 2016, the population was 8,850, which means that based on the trends from 2015, we've already surpassed the 2020 marker. So that's just trying to give you some sense of what that's implying. So again, I just want to make sure that we're aware of the limitations of this. We're only looking at the ACS data. It may include households that don't have kids. It may include smaller households. And again, I wanted to just reiterating that looking at that comparable subdivision, we had more like 3.4 persons rather than the 2.6 that we're using in these calculations. So the number is probably, if you just had someone waved a magic wand and all of these lots were built at once, you would probably have more than 1,000 people out of it. But again, it's important to know that these aren't going to just pop out of the ground. It's going to take time for these to develop.
I just, on the time, and that's the important thing, is it will take time, of course, but it will take less time than having to go through a full, they don't have to go back through the subdivision process, which can take, a year just in permitting, then build out. So these are just going to come faster, but still take time. So that's what we have a chart, and we talk a little bit about how to expect the growth to occur over the next couple of years, and it's all estimated. But
so the next question we wanted to see is, can we get an estimate of the kind of revenue that we would expect from these types of developments? So in order to do that, we had to answer a couple of questions. Obviously, there's no houses on these lots. They're not for sale, so we don't know how much they actually would be assessed at if they were for sale. So what we did is we took a sampling of single-family homes that were in subdivisions in Rutland. We did a median estimate of the value of the land, and then we did a median estimate of the total value, because the way the assessor's data is laid out is they record the land value, the building value, improvements, and then they give you a total. So the total includes any type of improvements that you build in the house. So we looked at the median land value minus the median total value to come up with this number here, which is what we might expect the value of a house being built on this. And this, we're referring to it as the value added, being you're taking an empty lot, you're adding a house on it. This is the increase in value you should expect from doing that. So we were looking that the total estimated lot was about that we came up with was about $271,000. When we did a 10-year estimate of the actual assessed value for the houses, it was off by about $100,000, but it was still low. And generally, in these estimates, as I said before, you want to be conservative. You actually want it to be lower. If it was higher than your mean, then I would have been a little bit freaked out. But because it was lower, it was close enough that we thought it would be a good ballpark. So to get the tax yield, we wanted to look at each of these lots. And so we took the total estimated value that we just talked about, divide it by 1,000, multiply it by the tax rate in order to get the amount of tax that each one of these improved lots should yield to the town. So, and the tax rate we used was the 2016 approved tax rate, and the reason we did that was because we wanted to make sure all of our data points had a source to them, that we weren't just taking, we think it's going to be this next year. We wanted to make sure that it was something that was already set in stone, it was in writing, it can be verified. So based on that, we take the number of estimated tax yield per lot, and then we can see that the tax yield there per year should be about $1.8 million for all 400 lots. So, but there's other revenues. The property taxes aren't the only thing that you end up getting from new population. So what we had to figure out is how can you calculate the amount of extra money you would get from the population? So what we got was we took the annual reports, we looked at the budget breakdown, we only looked at the actual receipts that the town recorded in each of the annual reports. We averaged those out for the period of 2012 to 2016 so that we could we wanted to try to iron out some of the fluctuations that you may see, and then divided that by the population and came up with a per capita multiplier that would allow us to get an estimate, say if we have 1,000 residents, times the extra revenues, about $550 a person. This is what the extra revenue would be. Then we add that extra revenue to the revenue that we got from the tax yield to get an estimate of how much, if all those houses were built, this is how, and occupied, and people were living in, and having to pay fees and additional taxes, this is what the town would be seeing from that activity. And that number is about $2.5 million, a little bit below that. So then we decided, what do we do with the costs? And we did the exact same thing. We went to the town, we looked at what they actually spent reported in the town budgets. We averaged those out between the same period, 2012 to 2016, divided that total by the population to get a per capita multiplier, per person, per head multiplier. And then multiplied that by the expected population. So we anticipated that the total projected expenditures would be about $2.1 million, so a little bit less. And we're going to get to some caveats in a minute. I just wanted to show what other impacts we looked at, and then we'll sort of explain how we do this. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to do this a little bit out of order, because I wanted to show the next step in the costs, and this sort of answers your question, ma'am, what we were looking at. How do we estimate whether or not we're getting more than we're spending in services? So we used a revenue to cost index, and what that basically does is you're just doing a very simple comparison, all the money you're taking in versus all the money you're spending out. What does that come up with? And what this number means is if you had a ratio of 1.0, that would mean you're getting exactly the same in as you're taking out. Get a slightly higher number, that means you're getting in more. Slightly lower number, you're losing money with all this new development. Now, based on what we looked at, the number we had was 1.14, which means that there's slightly more. You could probably read that as about 14% more revenue coming in from all this development that is going out. But there's a lot of caveats with that, because this number only looks at all of the expenses that were going out before these new lots were built. So we're not looking at new roads, we're not looking at the costs associated with any kind of new infrastructure that the town will end up adopting. And so when it seems like maybe you're getting in more than you're expending, this is actually a little bit alarming, because that 1.14 is not a lot of wiggle room. So you get a few big variations and that number will shift dramatically. So
Is that any place in any of what you've done of what it costs for new roads, new employees and trees and whatever else? I mean, it seems to me like all of a sudden that ratio is going to be like way.
well, and that ends up being a big cost, and that's something that we actually want to do as part of phase 2. Because one of the issues is that a lot of these, you can't just go to the developments, and some of them already have roads laid out, so maybe you could do an estimate based on that. But you have to be able to identify similar subdivisions, see how many roads they had, and generate an average, and then try to figure out what the town is spending per square. I forget what the modifier is, if it's like per metric yard or something like that. So it's a fairly complicated procedure, and within the scope of what we were looking at, we didn't have the ability to do that for this. But we are definitely going to be doing that going forward with the steps that we're looking to take in the next phase. And so the other thing that we were looking at, we wanted to try to look at some other impacts. And this is sort of a sample of the types of impacts that we can look at, getting again to what you were saying about the policemen, the firemen, the how much it's going to cost to continue running the library, et cetera. These are all factors that come into it. These 3 that we have here are ones that we were able to get solid data for, and that we felt confident we could put in the slide today. We looked at water usage, wastewater, and police and fire. We had good multipliers for all of these. The water usage was, again, from the annual reports this is just the drawdown from the Mushkapog? All right. I'm a native New Englander, so I'm used to Algonquin. Okay, so And then we did the same calculation, averaged it out over 5 year, or the 5-year period, and then looked and divided it by capita to see how much water each individual was using, and then multiplied that by the projected population increase. And that gave us this total of almost 50,000 gallons per day. Same thing with the wastewater. We found a multiplier that we were able to use in the Weston and Sampson report. I had to read that because I keep trying to say Smith and Wesson in my head, and that's not the name. And again, that's a gallons per day of wastewater. But again, that wastewater, that's not just sewer. That's what's going down with your going down the sink. That's what's being washed off into the roads. It's everything that goes into the sewer pipes. And with the police, this was an interesting one. This is actually based on the best practice rate that was cited in a report that the police chief did a few years ago. They were saying that the best practice was about 1.9 per 1,000 residents. So with the number of residents you're looking at, you'd look at about 2 new officers in order to be best practices. Actually, with the way that the town had been funding it, at least in 2015, it was closer to like 0.89 per 1,000 residents. So you probably wouldn't even see the need for a full officer at current funding levels. But if you wanted to change that, that's what it would be. So again, the things that we didn't look at, we didn't have a good multiplier for fire, municipal waste, recycling, electric usage. Again, these are just some of the samples of the types of things that we would be able to look at. Sewer capacity is a very important thing because we can look at the amount that's going into the pipes, but we didn't have a good way of measuring how much the pipes can handle, how much going into the treatment system. And that's something that we can look at. It's just going to need a lot more research and a lot of conversations with people who are experts in this because, frankly, I read the report and I didn't understand what they were talking about through some of it. So. And again, the estimated cost of new road adoption, that's a huge factor. If we can figure out how much it's going to cost to repair and keep clear all of these new roads that are going to be popping up in some of these subdivisions, that could add a whole new universe of costs. And again, want to make sure that we understand that all of these are estimates only. These numbers are just if all of them popped out of the ground and they were all occupied and everyone is all today. So we just have to keep that in mind. There's a lot of variables that are come into play into how fast this will happen. And if we have another crash, it could change everything. If the boom continues, then we could see patterns like we saw in that chart back in the early 2000s to 2006, where it was just a huge hump.
Before you get to the next one, I just wanted to jump in again because it's the constraints that we have in this study is really just time and money. So like I tried to introduce that it's a fairly small grant-funded look back at this, and so to find the data sources, I'm sure to some of you sitting out here or people at home, oh, well, just figure that stuff out. But it takes a lot of time in research and talking to people and going back in records and comparing, Chapter 90 funds to the actual amount of roads built, and there's just so much more research involved in the next step. So we felt like this is enough questions that another study is warranted. And so with the grant that we sought, the expectation is that the state will announce the awards at the end of December or January, is what they're saying. So our expectation is to get $35,000 to take this next step and solidify the data sources and the methods to do the calculations and then do the projections ahead. So I want people to know that we did what we could within our scope, and we're definitely identifying the things that need to be looked at, and it's just a matter of securing the funding. And if for some reason if the state doesn't award this grant, the town can come back to receive the DLTA funding again. It's just unclear, like to get that large of a chunk at one time. We were really excited when the state announced the technical assistance because it fit pretty well in there. So the caveats are that none of this is just easy to find. It takes a lot of research in figuring out how to measure these things, which are a lot. And then the next one, which Ron's going to talk about, is probably the trickiest of all, maybe. Maybe not.
So we saved this one for last because it's probably the elephant in the room that everybody would be worried about. When you have all this development, what happens with new students? How do you figure out how you can generate an estimate of the number of minors that come in with some of these developments? So the first thing we did was we tried taking a sample of all of the entire population, all the households in town, and seeing what that came up with. And that gave us, first we had the 0.6, which was sort of the leave off at with the per household multiplier. And that didn't really seem like it captured what people were seeing. Then we tried to do an estimate of the projections that the school gives about their enrollment projections just at the elementary school. And that was an even smaller multiplier. So we ended up doing something that was a little bit more grounded. And what that was is we looked at the town, it was what we spoke about a little bit earlier, where we looked at the town census and looked at the sample subdivision and saw in this subdivision that was a representative size and a representative style, how many minors were there in that subdivision. And what we actually found was that in that area, the average number of minors per household was actually 1.27. So it was a huge jump from what we were looking at before. Again, this is based on some assumptions. This is based on the assumption that it's all going to be subdivisions, that it's all going to be single-family housing, and that families are going to move there. But that seems to be the trend based on what we're seeing, so we feel pretty confident that we can talk about this. So that, based on that number, we're looking at a potential of more than 500 school-age people coming in. If, again, all the houses are built at once and they're all occupied, you can see as many as 500 minors, school-age people coming in. Now, we don't have any way, really good way, of breaking that out per age, saying, oh, how many are going to be in the elementary school versus how many are going to be in the middle school. So we kind of have to lump them all together in this. But we did we did have some conversations with people in the school department to kind of get their sense of what their capacity is. And one of the things that they were telling us is that one of the staffers estimated that the school department probably had 2 or 3 classrooms that they might be able to free up, and that's system-wide. So looking at the whole system, you get 500 students, you get 2 or 3 classes. If you're looking at a teacher-to-student ratio of maybe 20 to 40 at the most, I mean, I don't actually know anybody that would be happy with 40 students in a classroom ratio. But even at that, you're only looking at capacity for 120 kids in those 3 classrooms, and you could be looking at as many as 500 students. So this is a huge, huge potential impact. Yes?
What was the definition of a minor? What was the age of a minor?
It was 17 and under, I believe. So it was only capturing people who would be old enough to be in the school system. Now that doesn't take into account anybody who could be a dropout or who's who's being homeschooled. I don't know if that's captured in that, but actually it should be because we're looking at the census and just looking at minors.
And this slide here is capturing 3 schools in Rutland without the high school or including the high school?
Well, we spoke with this.
Includes the high school.
Yeah, we spoke with the regional school district, and they said system-wide they had about 3 classrooms that they could shift around without having to worry about building new infrastructure. Now, that was just a back-of-the-envelope estimate, so it's not something that we should take to the bank. So, and if we do something else with this, we would definitely want to get some more solid data that we would back that up with. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, when you have 500 kids, though, what you're asking about was the age difference. 3 different schools, that's not 500 students per one school, right?
It's not. No, it's not. It's just that they were saying that system-wide, they only had the capacity for that number of schools, and I was just trying to illustrate, if you filled all of those classrooms, that's the amount that you would be able to get. Now, it could be that all of the young people that would come in here are all elementary school age, or they're mostly elementary school age, or they're mostly high school age. There's really no way of estimating that. It's just trying to give a sense of what the potential impact might be with those kids. Mm-hmm.
With the school-age kids, is there any way to tell that from development, of what houses are being built, whether there's going to be young families
There's trends that we see. So when we see, you can see trends in the market. We see younger people buying certain types of houses versus people who are who have maybe older children or smaller families. We haven't looked at that data in Rutland, so we can't really say. I've looked at it in other towns, but we haven't looked at it here to see what those sort of sales patterns are.
It appears to be, you was driving down Ridge Road and seeing what, going up and down, a lot of new McMansions. Looks like a lot of new young families. And, the closer you start towards K grade, that's over the years, that's gonna be pretty financial, big nut to crack.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to go with this estimate rather than the much smaller estimate, because it seemed like when we were actually talking to people in the town, they were seeing in these types of subdivisions a lot of young families with a lot of young kids, and the idea that you'd have, half a child per household didn't seem realistic. So, and again, this may end up being high, but from what we're hearing from various people in the town, it's a pretty realistic number.
And could you talk about the NASDAQ projections and just that? So can you talk about that for a second and just explain how they come up with that number versus new migration in?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we wanted to compare it to is the school system has an organization that gives them their projections for what they should expect the school enrollment to look like. But the way that they projected, they were looking at around, give or take, 750, an average of 750 kids in the elementary school alone, because that was the data that we had to look at. And their estimates look predominantly at existing population and birth rates. They don't weight very strongly the new migration into town. So the number that they're looking at, they're projecting out and saying, oh, we're going to have 750 kids for the next 10 years, but they're not looking at the rate of growth that's coming in and the amount of new migration that's coming in. And again, that's one of the reasons why having that, doing the calculation the way we did to try to see if it was an average impact, if they were a lot of subdivisions with a lot of kids, with a lot of families, what might that look like?
This is where to try to figure that out will take more time and more research. And I didn't run this by you, I'm going to say it, but I see the NASDAQ projections as sort of a conveyor belt of students who go through the grade system, and it's kind of a pattern, and that's why the school can rely on the existing population and know that they'll cycle through, new people will come through, and it's a conveyor belt type of thing. The question about this influx of new housing are kind of two, which is how fast will it happen, which will impact whether there'll be a bubble class or a couple bubble classes. So how fast will it happen, and then what age group will be most likely to enter? And so those are the things that we don't have enough time in this round to figure that out. And I don't know, it seems like it's an art. It's truly an art to work through the school sort of demands and impacts more so than we can measure roads and we can calculate sewer use, but the school system is just dependent upon a population coming in, of which you can't control. So that's the variability that we'll struggle with through the phase 2, but I think we can put a finer point on it.
Well, and we can. And one of the tricks with this kind of number is that you have to find samples that you can identify trends out of. And there are ways to do it that don't require you going door to door and finding out how many young people there are. We ended up doing it this way because it was sort of an expedient. We wanted to just see what it would capture. And we thought that this was more representative of the kinds of developments we're seeing. So, but, lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Anyways. The important thing that we have to remember is that this is, even if you reach this number of students, this is over time. It's subject to a lot of variables, and there's a lot of things that can impact it. And trying to find those numbers of seeing like who will end up in the elementary school it'll change year by year, and it's a difficult thing to calculate, but we can definitely, with more resources, we can definitely do that.
Yeah, and I think to look at the patterns of 2000 to 2009, I think that there's a couple of capacity questions. So there's the capacity of a builder to how many houses could they construct in a year, which would probably be higher than the capacity of your current building inspector to inspect all those houses. So there's some kind of increase that will happen when these lots are built, but that's the unknown at this point until we get into phase 2. But when you look at that last number, the 55, that's this year. And I think the biggest thing that you can see coming is with the development of at least this subdivision, which we know is currently under construction and will most likely go through the spring and summer build out. So, and that's what we see this because it's happening. So this 120, 112, lots will be the first wave that you can see come through, and studying that and understanding what types of houses are built there and the type of families that live there will be somewhat indicative of the year after that. So there is we expect there to be a 2 to 3 or 4 year horizon for this to happen. It's not that it'll all happen next year, although this subdivision looks like it will, but other ones are not at that stage. So there is some time to keep looking and figuring some stuff out and make plans and take steps. But good questions. So I think did I interrupt you and cut you off before you were done?
I think that was the last slide. Let
Yeah,
me
we have the next steps.
double check.
Yeah, before we get to the questions, I did want to go and just quickly talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, is there one more? Do you want to talk about this one anymore?
What the?
So next steps. So we will post this presentation, this PowerPoint on the town's website, and it'll result in a written report for this round. The funding for phase 2, the town is pursuing that, and we are hoping to hear by sometime in January an announcement one way or the other on that. And if it's granted, then what we're going to look at is a build-out analysis, which will focus on future buildable lots. So we know this situation, but given what it's showing, the town is really well situated to start looking ahead and start understanding what other growth could be coming. So the build-out analysis will continue to look at a future population and continue to look at potential new students and other factors. And then accompanying that, we're looking at the fiscal impact of that same growth. And that's where a lot of you will still walk away with questions, and apologize for that, but that's what this fiscal impact will start to look at, is how to evaluate the potential tax revenue and expenditures, and looking at infrastructure, schools, and other town services, and then
Of the future growth
Of the
that
future
we can
growth.
predict based on the amount of open space that's currently in the town that's still suitable for development.
right, and that's important. And then with the future growth is where you have options to pursue zoning changes, modifying subdivision regulations, or looking at other methods to control or moderate that future growth. Unfortunately, looking back at the approved lots, you don't have those devices available, but you do looking forward. So,
And I just want to add that, again, that's an important point, because this exercise was not to make people freaked out about what's going to get built, because it's already approved, it's in process. Probably the only thing that's going to stop it are the property owners or the market, if they decide they don't want to, it's not going to be profitable to do it. But we wanted to do this to be able to show, based on this very interesting sample, this is sort of a unique situation you guys are in. We can look at something that you haven't seen happen yet, but we know is going to, project what it's going to look like, and show you what we can try to estimate when we're looking at land that is totally undeveloped, totally unapproved, that you actually can have the time to do something about if you want to do that.
hands, there was some question. Woman in pink.
This is all very interesting and informative, and I live down the road from the Bryce Lemon construction site, But I wanted to say that for the next phase or points beyond, it'd be interesting to put like that Bryce Lemon subdivision under a little bit more of a microscope to maybe figure out where are people coming from in terms of coming into Rutland? Are they coming from, in terms of the school district? Because I moved from Holden to Rutland. I don't have children, but if I did, they'd be in the same school district. So, and at the high school level, it would be the same, like, 2 kids that I had, because they'd still be going to Wachusett. So it'd be interesting to see when people come into Rutland, are they coming from the regional school district area, or are they coming from points beyond?
Right.
Because you could be double counting the numbers for the enrollment at certain levels.
Yeah, no, and that's an important caveat especially about the education side of it, because that doesn't take into account that's assuming that everybody who comes in here is brand new to the town, brand new to all the systems, they're just added. But you are correct, with the school system, if they are moving around within the school district, then that changes things. Although if they have elementary school age kids, it still ends up being an impact to the town, a new impact to the town. But again, we'd have to be able to figure out how to tease that out, and that's something we want to look at in this next round.
Yeah, I had a question about the, you were talking about very limited ways in which we can kind of control construction of new homes, especially the ANRs. But one thing with the Bryce Lemon is that they have 2 pumping stations, and I'm sorry that Gary left before I could say what a great job he does with the DPW, but it does put additional strain on them to have to, once we take over those pumping stations and the roads and the infrastructure, is there a way for us to limit pumping stations as a way to limit sewer resources?
I would go with maybe anything's possible, but it won't be looking back at these. It'll be something that you have to set as a goal for future development. So that's a sort of a painful reminder that with looking back, we can't do anything, but we may, with this extra funding, we'll look at other options, especially going forward. And the build-out will help project, do you expect more? And with the fiscal and the build-out combined, you can start to better understand where more development might be likely, and then you could focus on certain areas and possible strategies more tailored. So if they're in proximity to an existing sewer system, then you might expect that those areas could be more likely to be developed first, because they're going to be able to connect, and that's when you would
Right,
make
which is the
some kind
writing
of
on the
other
wall with
regulations.
this one, because Sharnock Hill is not in a sewer system. We don't have sewers out there until this got built in, but now he also owns the property across the street, which is Noble Hill. And when they put the sewer going up Sharnock and down Main Street, it looks very much like he's planning on tying in Noble Hills.
Right, so yeah, that's definitely a question that we want to explore.
And one of the things that we want to look at much more closely is the water impacts on the town. And one of the reasons is because that's one of the few areas where the state allows the town to have a little bit more control over it. So if you can demonstrate that you're showing significant impacts to your water system, then you have a few things that you might be able to do, a few avenues that you can do that don't necessarily require, they don't fall under like the strict rules of ANR and the subdivision laws.
And is that something that your phase 2 would look at, the water?
It is, yeah. We did look at it in a very broad sense in this, just so we could kind of show what we can do, but we would definitely need to look at what sort of environmental impact it's having, whether or not the draw that would be coming with new development is actually going to impact the quality or the amount of water. Are you actually affecting your aquifers? There's a lot that goes into that.
Certainly.
Sir, my gosh, that does it. Sir, two of them. Are you going to check on what is the sewer capacity left in the line?
That's
It's
one of the-
not. I didn't think it was that much. So.
Yeah,
I'd
that's
like-
not something we had the ability to look at this round, and that's something we really want to look at in the next phase, because that's a whole different category than how much is going in, how much can the pipes take, how much can the treatment take. That's a very big question.
Also, right now with Bryce Lemon coming on eventually here, what kind of an impact is that going to make on traffic in the center of this town and in Holden, too? And thank goodness I don't have to travel it.
Well, and that's another number that we didn't take a look at in this round. But we do have a traffic department in our, in CMRPC that could provide us, should be able to provide us with some good data on that, at least with trends. And as long as we can get a, some sort of multiplier, some sort of trend, we can use that to project out at least a rough estimate of what you'll be able to see. It's a little bit more complicated with traffic because it changes from minute to minute, but you can still come up with trends that'll help you get some sort of grip on what that'll do.
Follow-up question on the sewer thing. If we're maybe reaching capacity, but we really don't know, somebody's building 100 homes, is it at all up to them to find out all that stuff and for them to kick in the extra money and the studies and whatnot? I mean, how do we get that out of the developments instead of everybody else?
Yeah, the idea of a sort of an impact fee for development proposals is still not well solidified in Massachusetts. Again, it goes to Massachusetts has some pretty antiquated stuff. Other states have impact statements, impact fees that come with the proposal, but that might be the kind of tool that you may have in the future, for sure.
Can we impose it? I mean, as a town, can we impose an impact fee, or does Massachusetts tie our hands?
I believe Massachusetts ties your hands.
Yeah, there are some opportunities, but it's pretty limited. It just, the reiteration that I must make is that looking back is hard, because you have very limited ability to look back on stuff that's already been approved. But looking forward is where we can explore those options, and it will be on the list, I'm sure. It's just complicated, and you have to be careful of not having an impact fee be determined to be an extraction from the developer. So there's a lot of study and data that would have to go along with that. But it's something that we'll explore for sure. I think it makes sense to ask that question.
Yeah, and I believe that there's an organization, I know there's an organization that is working to try to change the ANR laws at the state level, and they've been doing it for years. No. The impact fees is something that they've been trying to push as well, and they say they've gotten more traction with it in the last couple of years than they have. I don't know how much traction they're getting with the ANR repeal. But it's something that's definitely been on the table year after year. If you're interested in it, call your senator, maybe.
Were there other questions?
I can't say that, I'm sorry.
I had a comment, there's a lot of questions about the sewer capacity, and that's certainly a legitimate issue, but historically in the town of Rutland, it's not the capacity of the line that's been at issue, it's our allocation to that capacity in the line that's been the issue. Because we don't have our own sewer treatment plant, we're allocated a certain space, if you will, within the line that transports our waste to up Blackstone where it's treated. So that's the bigger issue in the town of Rutland. We have to negotiate that with various organizations, cities such as Worcester and the DCR. So that's our bigger issue. But the other thing is, going back to the impact fee, I think we probably do have some leeway within our sewer use regulations. I know when we developed our sewer use regulations, one of the things that we looked at was the pump station, for example. And we did build into that some impact analysis and some impact fees, if you will, for future maintenance having to do with the cost, down the road having to do with those sewer treatment plants. So there is some flexibility to build that into local regulation.
Right. Good.
Yeah, Joe brings up a good point about the sewer allocation. So, yeah, the town does have an agreement with DCR that provides for a certain amount of sewerage to be transported through the lines. The question then becomes, in the future, at what point does new development meet or exceed, potentially exceed those allocations, in which case we'd be in violation of our sewer use agreement with DCR. So those are things that really, really should be looked into.
One last one.
Yes.
How do you have any idea why we are 10 times the building than any of the other rural areas?
It's a nice town to live in.
Yeah. No,
Quick.
Location.
having lived in the area,
You wanna
and,
introduce yourself?
yeah, I'm Janet Pierce, I'm the executive director of CMRPC, and it's really great to have everybody here, thanks for coming out, and, I grew up in Barry and I now live in New Braintree, and I avoid coming through the center of this town at all possible. And when I started working, it was back in the early 80s, and I had to go to Shrewsbury. And so I've seen the development in the town, I felt the traffic congestion problems, and especially in Holden when you would get there and whatnot, and having worked with CMRPC for the last 9 years. But I think part of it is because of the close proximity to Worcester and the easy commute there. And if you think back to the 80s, we were talking about this earlier today, and coming from this area, there was a lot of development in Rutland, probably mid-80s or so, as I think of when the congestion started. And some of that was passed along to Ocam. It was just one town further, but it was easy to get to 122. They had a little bit more of what's considered snob zoning, so there was more frontage requirement and larger acreage. They also didn't have the infrastructure. They don't have water and sewer like Rutland had. So Rutland has been very appealing to those people that maybe couldn't afford the Shrewsbury prices, but they could still move into Rutland. Holden, I don't think, had as much development at the time. And it certainly wasn't at the percentage of growth that Rutland was experiencing. So if you were looking for a home, you could come to Rutland. Also, the reputation of your school district. You have a very good school district. I know that it's painful to fund the school district and part of this growth management study, and it's not uncommon. You're not alone. It doesn't make it easier, but you're not alone. Most of the communities in our region are that way. So Barry also experienced a growth back in the 80s, and then it slowed down a little bit. And I think most of it was because of all the development that was in Barry. I mean, in Rutland. Why keep going out with these populations and increasing populations? And Rutland's a really nice town. Why wouldn't you move to Rutland? The open space and, you know, there is the protected watersheds, but it offers so much to everyone. And if your neighbor from Worcester moved to Rutland, or your neighbor from Northborough, or you know, from Gardner was moving out this way, then it would open up your eyes for the opportunities, and you had the market. You had the units that were available, and your developers did very well. So why wouldn't they stay in town to continue the development? It was a friendly town to develop in. We have some communities that are anti-development, anti-housing. Don't even talk about putting one house up. So Rutland welcomed this. And I think that's how it started, just from having the history in this area. Another community which we did talk about, and they were pretty much done with their presentation, but Hubbardston has experienced the growth as well. Just one town out, it's a little bit closer to the workforce area of Leominster, Gardner, the cities up to the north, but it's only one town up on 68, so come down 68, you're right onto 122A to go into your workforce areas.
Go out Route 2 and you're in
Right,
Boston.
and Route 2, you have that accessibility. And I'm just stopping in Worcester, never mind going Metro West and into Boston as well. And we have those numbers. Jeff mentioned our transportation department, and we do have where people are commuting from, where they're coming from, where they're going, what hours they come from as well, and what your daytime population is as opposed to the nighttime population. And if you were a larger employer, sometimes you may have more of a population during the day if you had some big industry, like a FlexCon, for instance, versus those that are leaving town to work elsewhere.
I think one other thing that it's important to remember is that there's that old saying in politics that geography is destiny. One of the things that we've seen, we didn't look at it in Rutland, but we've seen it in other towns, where part of the reason why some towns don't get any development and others do is just a simple matter of you've got really good, you may have just really good soil, you may just have a lot of really good available land. You know, that something as simple as that can have a huge impact in whether or not developers want to build here. I know there's another town that we were working in where they were saying that part of the reason it's because it's almost all slope. They basically, the whole town is built in a hill. So it's an exaggeration, obviously, but.
Right, so there are a lot of factors that are difficult to pinpoint. So with all of this, then you have an underlying real estate market that is created, you know, in these dips down, people are buying land, the prominence of people accumulating land and then amassing it. And if you are lucky enough to own real estate, it's the biggest and most valuable thing you could do is own real estate. And if you have the ability to gather real estate and then slowly spread it out and sell it and develop it, then that all those things come together and make sort of, you know, one place that's pretty prominent. So the written report, so the presentation will be posted on the town's website probably by, like, let's say Monday. And then this will be recorded. We'll have a written report by early January. And then hopefully there'll be a big announcement of phase 2 coming soon. So, yes, sir.
One last thing, you know, you're talking about all this growth and everything else, but the one thing that we're losing is farmland. And eventually, we're gonna kick out the reason why a lot of us come here, because of the nice visual effects that farms have, the land and everything else.
Yeah.
So I think we also should be looking into how to protect a lot of that farmland.
No, that's a very good point. So the town has a new an updated open space and recreation plan, which is so most towns go forward with certain planning activities, and one is an open space plan, and so the town recently updated it. So with the build-out analysis, it will show areas that remain developable, and then what part of the activity is for the town through, you know, community events and similar activities is to then look at the developable lands and determine whether that would be better used as protected open space or whether it could be suitable for development. The hardest part of that equation is finding the money to purchase land to prevent development is elusive, and I think, you know, I know that other towns, the issue of something like the Community Preservation Act makes people bristle, but with property sales, you can accumulate money that serves that specific purpose to buy open space. So you know, I'm not trying to pitch a Community Preservation Act. However, it is the type of funding source that a town needs to then say that land right there should be protected open space, and you have this pool of money to buy open space or preserve historic structures and things like that. So it is part of that toolkit that probably gets built over the next couple of years of things for the town to consider, and all the things have to kind of work together to really accomplish the overarching goal of the town. So it's, well, like a master plan and things like that. So
The master plan.
Well, thank you again for coming. Appreciate it.
All right. Yes.